Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Walter Williams.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that very warm welcome. The title of my talk this evening is The Legitimate Role of Government in a Free Society. Now, I'm going to say some things that will break with conventional wisdom in many ways. I'm going to say some things that sound perhaps evil, uncaring, insensitive, politically incorrect. And to the extent that any of those are true, you should feel free to raise any kind of question you want during the question and answer period. You need not show me any undue courtesy because I'm your guest. Raise hard questions, because these are very important questions. Don't worry about insulting me. I am uninsultable. The only way you could possibly insult me is suggest that I wasn't pretty good in basketball. And that's a matter of ethnic pride that I take seriously. One of the justifications for the growth of government, far beyond what the founders of our nation envisioned, is to promote fairness and justice. Now, that might be a worthy goal, but at the same time, we might want to ask, what is fairness and justice? What is the legitimate role of government in a free society? Let me spend just a few moments talking about what the founders of our nation saw as the legitimate role of the federal government. And to do that, let's go to the rule book that they gave us, namely the United States Constitution. Most of what the founders visioned as the legitimate role for the federal government is found in Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution, which I encourage you to read. Just let me briefly quote some sections thereof. It says, the founders gave the Congress the right to collect taxes, duties, and imposts, to pay the debts, and provide for the common defense and the general welfare of the United States. It gave Congress the power to borrow money on the credit of the United States, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. It gave Congress the authority to coin money, establish post offices, and post roads. And the framers gave Congress taxing and spending authority for these and a few other activities. Namely, if you read Article 1, Section 8, there's 21 things that Congress is authorized to do. Nowhere in the Constitution do we find authority for Congress to tax and spend for up to 3/4 of what Congress taxes and spends for today. That is, there's no constitutional authority for Congress to spend money on agricultural handouts, for saving failing businesses, for welfare, food stamps, Medicare, not to mention midnight basketball. Now, through numerous successful attacks, there have been attacks on private property and free enterprise. And Thomas Jefferson one of the great founders of our nation, he anticipated this when he said, "The natural progress of things is for government to gain ground and for liberty to yield." The best way of looking at the process of how government is gaining ground and liberty yielding is to look at what has happened to taxation and spending in our nation over the course of our history. Now, there's only one way, ladies and gentlemen, to look at taxes. Taxes represent government claims on private property. Indeed, if government were to tax private property at 100%, it would confiscate it. And we find that taxes have been going up. An even better measure of what government does is to look at what has happened to spending, federal spending over our history, well, federal and local spending. Since between 1787, the date of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and 1925, federal expenditures were 3% of the GDP. Today, federal expenditures are close to 25% of the GDP. State and local governments spend roughly 8% of the GDP. Now, the average American in 1787, he worked 7 days to pay federal, state, and local taxes. Today, the average American works from January 1st until late April to pay federal, state, and local taxes. Now, what's the significance of this? Well, the significance is that as time goes by, we own less and less of our most valuable property, namely ourselves and the fruits of our labor. Another way of looking at this is that the average American does not have the rights to decide how the fruits of his labor will be used. Somebody else makes that decision. Now, in the economic sphere, the founders thought that relatively free markets, or what is called capitalism, was the most effective social organization for the promotion of personal liberty. Indeed, capitalism is defined as a system where individuals are free to pursue their own interests. There is voluntary exchange. There are property rights held in goods and services. And indeed, much of the original intent of the United States Constitution was to bring about a climate in which this kind of social organization could occur. Now, the great benefit that goes ignored by most Americans is that the great benefit of the free enterprise system is that through private ownership of property, it minimizes the capacity of one person to coerce another person. And so it restricts government to the legitimate functions of government. And what are the legitimate functions of government in a free society? Well, one legitimate function of government is to protect you and I, you and me, from international thugs who wish to violate our private property rights. So that says that one legitimate function of government in a free society is to protect you and me, is to provide for national defense. Another legitimate function of government at some level is to protect you and me from domestic thugs violating our private property rights. So that says that at some level of government there should be the provision of police services. Other legitimate functions of government in a free society are those of adjudication of disputes, providing certain public goods, that is, public goods that benefit all Americans. And I might also add, each American is duty-bound to pay his share of these legitimate functions of government. Now, some people might argue, if you talk to some of your legal friends, they might say, well, this guy Williams has a very, very narrow view of the United States Constitution. They'll tell you that our Constitution is a living document. Now, anybody who says that our Constitution is a living document, we have a living Constitution, is also at the same time saying that we don't have a Constitution. That is, for the rules of the game, the Constitution represents the rules of the game. And for the rules of the game to mean anything, they must be fixed. And you can look at it another way. I could ask you, well, how many of you would like to play me poker this evening and the rules be living? That is, under certain circumstances, my two pair can beat your three of the kind. Now, of course, the founders gave us a way to change the rules of the game, to amend the Constitution, the Article 5, as a means to amend the United States Constitution. Now, for the last half century, free enterprise and what it implies has been under unrelenting attack in our country. Americans from all walks of life, whether they realize it or not, have demonstrated a deep and abiding contempt for private property rights and economic freedom. Free enterprise in our country is threatened today not because of its failure, but somewhat ironically, because of its success. That is, capitalism or free enterprise has been so successful in eliminating the traditional problems of mankind, such as disease, pestilence, hunger, and gross poverty, that all other human problems appear to us to be at once inexcusable and unbearable. The desire by many Americans to eliminate these so-called inexcusable and unbearable problems has led us away from the basic ideals and principles upon which our nation was built. In the name of other ideals, such as equality of income, sex and race balance, affordable housing, medical care, orderly markets, consumer protection, energy conservation, we go on and on, we have abandoned many personal freedoms. As a result of widespread control by government in an effort to achieve these so-called higher objectives, we're increasingly being subordinated to the point where considerations of personal liberty are either secondary or tertiary matters. What I'm saying, basic personal liberty is treated with contempt by our government. Now, you say, well, aren't you exaggerating a little bit, Williams? Well, imagine I write a letter to the United States Congress. I tell them, my name is Walter Williams. I am an emancipated adult. I am fully capable of taking care of my retirement needs. And if I fail to do so, let me starve or beg, but stop taking money out of my paycheck for Social Security. How do you think I'd be greeted? It'd be greeted with contempt. That is, here are some people telling you and me how much we should set aside out of each week's paycheck for retirement. How would you feel if they told us how much to set aside for housing, for entertainment, for food? We'd view it with contempt. We'd really say that that is totalitarianism. But we Americans accept that. Now, the ultimate end to this process that we're witnessing in our country is totalitarianism. Now, I am not saying that we are a totalitarian nation yet. But if you ask the question, which way are we headed, tiny steps at a time, are we headed towards more personal liberty or more government control over our lives? It'd have to unambiguously be the latter. More government control over our lives. Now, again, the ultimate end to this is totalitarianism. Now, we're not, as I said, we're not a totalitarian yet, but we're moving there tiny steps at a time. The great philosopher David Hume said, "It is seldom that liberty of any kind is lost all at once. It's always lost bit by bit." And that's what we're losing, our liberty bit by bit. My late colleague, Leonard Read, the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education, he explained it another way, and I like it this way. He said that if you wanted to take liberty away from Americans, you had to know how to cook a frog. And he said that you cannot cook a frog by putting on a pot of boiling water and throwing the frog in the water, because the frog's reflexes are so quick that as soon as his feet hit the boiling water, he'd hop away and be free. Leonard Read said the way to cook a frog is to put on a pot of cold water and put the frog in the water and heat it up bit by bit. And by the time the frog realized he was being cooked, it was too late. That's the same thing with the American people. Anybody coming over here, taking all of our liberties all at once, we would righteously rebel. But they can talk about taking away our liberties bit by bit, as they're doing. Now, the primary justification for the attack on private property, economic freedom, and privacy can be found in people's desire for the government to do good. We all say things like, well, government should care for the poor. Government should help failing businesses. Government should help the elderly. Government should help college students. Government should help other deserving segments of our society. But we have to recognize that government or Congress has no resources of its very own. That is what I mean by that is that all those programs coming out of Washington or your state capital, it does not represent congressmen and senators reaching in their own pockets and sending out the money. Moreover, there's no tooth fairy or Santa Claus giving them money. So when you recognize that government has no resources of its very own, that forces you to recognize that the only way the government can give one American citizen $1 is to first, through intimidation, threats, and coercion, confiscate that dollar from some other American. Now, if you think I'm being too loose with the terms intimidation, threats, and coercion, well, you have until April 15th next year to check me out on that. You can tell the agents of Congress that you're very happy to pay the constitutionally mandated function of the federal government, but you are not going to have your earnings going to help foreigners, poor people, failing businesses, farmers. You will see all the intimidation, threats, and coercion that you want to see, and if you act it too tough, you get shot by the agents of the United States government, by the Congress. In other words, we Americans, we support And we encourage government to do those immoral things that if a private person did the identical thing, we would roundly condemn him as an ordinary, despicable, low-down thief. Let me give you an example of this. Suppose I see an elderly lady sleeping on a grate in downtown Washington in the dead of winter. She's hungry, she needs medical attention, and she needs shelter. And suppose I walked up to Ron with a gun in my hand, and I said, Ron, give me your $200. And then with the $200, I go down, buy the lady some medical attention, some shelter, and food. Would you find me guilty of a crime? Of course you'd find me guilty of crime. You'd find me guilty of theft. And what is theft? Theft is taking the rightful property of one person and giving it to another to whom it does not belong. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that helping one's fellow man in need is praiseworthy and laudable. I think that helping one's fellow man in need by reaching in your own pockets to do so is praiseworthy and laudable. Helping your fellow man by reaching in somebody else's pockets to do so is worthy of condemnation. And for the Christians among us, we have to keep in mind, when God gave Moses the commandment, thou shalt not steal, he didn't mean that thou shalt not steal unless you got a majority vote in the United States Constitution. He meant thou shalt not steal. Now, do-gooders in our nation, they fail to consider that most good done in the world is not done in the name of good. Let me give you an example of this. You had Texas cattle ranchers last winter going out in blizzards, feeding stray cows, trying to take care of them, making this personal sacrifice to make sure that New Yorkers had beef on their shelves. You have Idaho potato farmers this summer doing backbreaking work, the sun beating down, the bugs biting them, dirt underneath their fingernails, making this personal sacrifice to make sure New Yorkers also have potatoes on their shelves. Now, do you think that Texas cattle ranchers and Idaho potato farmers are doing this because they love New Yorkers? They may hate New Yorkers. I'm not that wild about New Yorkers myself. But they make sure that beef and potatoes gets New York every single day of the week. Why? Because they love themselves. And I would be worried about New Yorkers if they're getting their beef and potatoes dependent on human love and kindness. I'd be seriously worried. Let me give you another example of the virtue of self-interest. I like to call it greed. People trying to get more for themselves. But a lot of people say, well, Williams, don't use the term greed because you're trying to win friends and influence people. Why don't you say enlightened self-interest? Well, that's okay. But I've often told people that I don't care about future generations of Americans. And some people are shocked when I tell them that. They say, Williams, how come you don't care about future generations? And I say, well, what have future generations ever done for me? I mean, some kid that's going to be born in 2050, what has he done for me? And if he hasn't done anything for me, how then am I obliged to do anything for him? Where's the quid pro quo? But however, if you watch my actual behavior, it would belie that sentiment. A number of years ago, I planted seedlings on my property. Now, when those trees reach their full maturity, I'll be dead. There'll be some 20, 50 kid swinging my tree, eating my apples, my pears. Mrs. Williams, she made extensive improvements to the house. Beautiful sunroom. And that sunroom is going to outlast us. And there'll be some 20, 50 kid tracking mud in my sunroom. Now, what's at least some of the motivation of my sacrificing current consumption to benefit a future generation? Well, it's very easy. The nicer my house is, the longer it will provide housing services, what? The higher the price I get when I go to sell it. That is, by pursuing my own narrow selfish interests, I can't help but make a house available for a future generation, whether I care about them or not. Let me give you another example. You people look like nice people. I don't know whether you're nice or what. But a lot of you are concerned about the extinction of various species of animals. And I don't care. And it's a practical matter. I mean, according to scientists, biologists, 94% of everything that has ever lived on Earth is now extinct. And I say, why getting a tizzy over 94.3.7, whatever? But I remember a number of years ago, I was listening to NPR, and people were demonstrating in New York, in front of the United Nations, because they were concerned about the extinction of the white rhino, or of gorillas, or animals. And I wrote down the list of animals that they were concerned about becoming extinct. And so, and they formed Ducks Unlimited and Save the Whale clubs and stuff like this. So I wrote down this list of animals. And then I wrote down another list of animals, cows, pigs, animals very valuable to us, sheep, chickens. I said, how come nobody's marching for the chicken? Or forming Save the Pig clubs. What's the essential difference between the animals that people are very concerned about becoming extinct and these other animals that are very valuable to us, that nobody's concerned about them? Well, the basic difference is that pigs, cows, and sheep, they belong to somebody. Somebody's private, personal interest is at stake. With lions, giraffe, apes, gorillas, they don't belong to anybody. And nobody's personal, private wealth is at stake. So if you see somebody's concerned about the extinction of various animals, just suggest privatizing them. Now, despite the virtues, and I'm leaving out a lot of stuff here, and you're just going to spend the rest of your lives not knowing it. But despite the virtues of free markets, never mind, it was with the rise of capitalism that brought better treatment to women, racial minorities, the handicapped, criminals, and the insane. There's considerable hostility towards free markets. Yeah, I was giving this talk at a university some years ago, and a young lady stood up. She's a feminist. I don't call them what Rush calls them. But she said, capitalism is oppressive to women. And I asked her, I said, well, if you're a radical feminist, what country do you want to live in? Saudi Arabia, China? You want to live in the United States or Western Europe. Or if you're a criminal, where do you want to go to jail? Mexico? You want to go to jail in the United States so you don't miss your HBO shows in the afternoon. Now, One of the reasons why capitalism or free markets is humane is because it was with the rise of capitalism it became possible for people to become wealthy, not by enslaving, plundering, and looting their fellow man, but by serving their fellow man. That is, why is Bill Gates, how come he has such a lot of money? Well, it's because he served his fellow man. He's produced something that his fellow man wants. And so capitalism, this is an ignored aspect of capitalism. Now, almost every group in our nation has come to feel that the government owes them a special favor. Manufacturers feel the government should protect them. Manufacturers feel that government owes them protective tariffs. That is, to keep foreign goods out so they can charge you and me higher prices. Farmers feel that government owes them crop subsidies. Labor unions feel that government ought to protect their jobs from competition from those who are not union members. College professors think that government ought to give them money to do studies, like do studies on poverty, get $500,000 grants to do studies on poverty, and have meetings in Miami in the winter to talk about poor people. And everybody's involved with this. That is, conservatives rail against food stamps, aid to families of dependent children, legal aid, but they come out in support for aid to dependent farmers, aid to dependent banks, aid to dependent motorcycle companies. Conservatives, as well as liberals, prove that H.L. Mencken's definition of an election is quite right. If somebody asked H.L. Mencken, for those of you who have forgotten, he was a political satirist for the Baltimore Sun, they asked him to give a definition of an election. And H.L. Mencken replied, "Government is a broker in pillage, and every election is an advance auction on the sale of stolen goods." To the extent that H.L. Mencken is correct, I think we've identified our problems as a nation. That is, politicians are doing precisely what we elect them to office to do. And what do we elect them to office to do? We elect them to office to use the power of their office to take what belongs to one American and bring it back to us. Now you say, well, look, Williams, you really come a long way to insult the people of California. Well, ask yourself the following question. Suppose I were running for the Senate in California, and I go up and down across the state and I say, look, my fellow Californians, I've read the United States Constitution. And if you elect me to the Senate, don't expect from me to bring back highway construction funds, aid to higher education, farm subsidies. Do you think I would get elected to the Senate in California or of any state? No, I wouldn't, because I would not be doing what the people of California or any other state wanted me to do, namely use the power of my office to take what belongs to one American and bring it back to them. And the tragedy for us is that Californians would be behaving exactly right by not electing me to the Senate. And the reason why is that if I don't bring back billions of dollars to the people of California, it doesn't mean that Californians pay a lower federal income tax. All that it means is that Arizona gets it instead. That is, once legalized theft begins, it pays for everybody to participate. And those who don't participate wind up holding the brown end of the stick. And those of you who have agricultural background, you know what the brown end of the stick is about. Let me close by saying that I think that if our founders were to come back today, they'd be quite disappointed in you and me. That we've been so willing to accept safety in exchange for liberty. But I'd also say something that's a little bit more encouraging, and that is the American people have not done the wrong thing for a long time. That is, throughout our history, we managed to get our act together. And we better be about getting our act together right now while we have the freedom to do so. Thank you very much, and if you have questions, I'll try to answer them. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. And don't be hesitant about asking questions. If you feel somewhat reluctant, just say that I have a liberal friend who said, if I ever see you, ask him this.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't really have a question, but I thought I could help you with one of your stories. You were telling the story of holding up Ron Robinson in order to help the lady in the street who needed medical care and everything like that, and you said that you took $200 and used it for her. I don't think that's right. I think you kept $50 and used $150 to take care of the lady, and that's what the government would do.
Yeah. But still, it's immoral. This lady over here had a question. Yeah, I have some. Thanks.
This is not well framed either, but the spigot has been opened up at full blast. And I don't know how or what you propose, what the solution would be to close the spigot on losing our freedom right now. But it seems every day it's coming at us faster and faster.
Mm-hmm. Well, it reflects a moral problem in our country, a deep moral problem. And when I say a deep moral problem, I mean, I think that it is immoral for one American to be forcibly used to serve the purposes of another American. And I think that if it were quite explicit, then you and I would have difficulty in doing it. For example, imagine that there's an elderly lady down the street from you. She's a widow, and she cannot mow her lawn herself. And how many people do you think, even your liberal friends, how many people do you think would force a person to go down every week to mow her lawn? You probably would not find that many people, even our liberals among us, that would force a person under the pain of imprisonment or death to go down and mow this lady's lawn. Well, let's look at another one. Well, how many people would force somebody in the neighborhood to take $50 out of their earnings each week to go down and buy the lady lawnmower services? Not too many people would support that, I don't think. But they would support each of us being taxed and the money going into a government pot, and then the government would send the money out to help the lady out, to get her lawn mowed. Many people would support that. But nonetheless, it represents the forcible use of one person to serve the purpose of another. And matter of fact, the forcible use of one person to serve the purpose of another is a fairly good working definition of slavery. That is the forcible use of one person to serve the purpose of another. And tragically, many Americans accept that that's okay to do that. And so I think to a significant degree, we need a moral reawakening. Now, James Madison is the acknowledged father of the United States Constitution. And in 1794, Congress appropriated $15,000 to help some French refugees. James Madison stood on the floor of the House, irate, and he said, and I'm virtually quoting him, he said that I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article of the Constitution which granted a right to Congress of expending on the objects of benevolence the money of their constituents. That's the father of the Constitution. Can you imagine what the American people would do to a politician running for office today who said the same thing? We would run him out of town on a rail. Or James Madison also said that, because a lot of politicians say, well, we do it general welfare. And he said, well, I've always regarded general welfare as qualified by the details in the Constitution. James Madison also said that charity is not a legitimate role for government. Can you imagine what the American people would do to a politician saying the same thing today? We'd run him out of town on a rail. And so I think that's a big part of the problem of our nation. We've lost our moral footing. We think that legalized theft is okay. That's what I would do in the case of taking Ron's money to help the poor person or lady. That's legalized theft. Oh, I'm sorry.
Is it the case that Wilt Chamberlain got so good at that fadeaway jump shot because you kept denying the drop step to the basket when it was your turn to guard him?
No, he was just good. No, he was just good. As a matter of fact, I used to beat him at one time, and then over one summer, he lived right across the street from my cousin, and over one summer, I just could not touch him. I lived in North Philadelphia, and he lived in West Philadelphia, and I used to come over during the summer. And I used to laugh at him because he was a big, stringly guy. They called him Wilt the Stilt at the time. And just evidently somebody told him, don't let that guy do that to you. And so he learned.
Yeah, a lot of people come to the United States for the benefits that the United States have, both legitimate and welfare type. But it's all based on wealth, and I'm kind of curious about the definition of wealth. To me, wealth is agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and energy. Everything else feeds off those areas. For instance, Greece is in bad shape because their tourist industry is down. And Egypt is in bad shape because their tourist industry is down. Well, the solution, obviously, is to send the Egyptian tourists to Greece and the Grecian tourists to India, and they're both solved. But there's no wealth there. What do you think?
Well, wealth is economists consider wealth to be a stock, and it consists of all those things that are capable of producing more wealth. And part of what wealth is even human capital and physical capital. And as a nation, we are very, very wealthy in terms of physical capital and human capital. And human capital consists of all man's physical and mental talents. But however, with human capital, there's a threat by our education system. It's not doing as well as otherwise could do in terms of promoting human capital or creating human capital.
Good evening, Dr.
attention.
Williams.
Yes.
Thank you very much for traveling. I know that's something you don't necessarily like to do, and we appreciate your talk. And 42 years of talking to our kids, that is wonderful. That's outstanding.
Thank you.
Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
I think I totally agree in terms of the moral problems in the country, and that charitable institutions do tremendous things that government can't. In the current economic program debate, there's an issue of tax deductibility of charitable contributions. I was just wondering on your thoughts, given your comments tonight, on what do you think would happen to charitable deductions to well-serving organizations should that government sticking their hands in other people's pockets stop with this particular deduction?
Well, keep in mind that we American people are the most charitable people on the face of the earth. I believe that we do slightly over 80% of all world giving. And this charitable urge in us has been something that's been with us for quite a while, before there was even the income tax system. I think when Alexis de Tocqueville came to our country to study prisons, but he really went around the country looking at the American people. And when he went back to France, he was giving lectures. He says, those Americans, they just love committees. He said, somebody's barn burns down to have a committee. Somebody becomes widow to have a committee. And he was just talking about the generosity of Americans. And the big, a number of the big foundations that got engaged in charity, they were started in the 1800s. And before we had an income tax code in 1916. And so I'm not fully aware what would be the effect of lowering the tax deductibility of charitable contributions. I don't know, but I'm just telling you one thing is that we became a very charitable people before we even had an income tax code. And probably the income tax code, probably I would guess, or I was just guessing, it didn't help charity that much. I'm just guessing, but I could be wrong about that. Somebody with the microphone. Somebody get this fellow. He's been holding his hand up for a while, but back there, yeah.
Okay. Hi. Well, mine is not so much a question as I'm speaking to you from a point of frustration. I have great respect for you personally and for what you stand for, but I will tell you, I attend events here regularly, and probably 90% of the topics that you have touched on tonight, I've already heard here before many times. I agree with them across the board, but I am very frustrated because I don't really see us, other than the exception of electing Donald Trump, which hopefully will be a positive change, I don't see a great movement forward. And I found that your comments, to be specific to what you said, your comments regarding animals. You said, what would make, we protect the pigs or the cows or whatever, we should privatize them versus the preservation of the rhinoceros or the ape or whatever. I think that this is why we are not reaching a lot of young people today, because we are being very flippant about that. Just addressing the wild species, for example. None of us, I don't think, want to see elephants or rhinoceros or any other rare breed in Africa or wherever become extinct. And yet, in reality, a lot of these breeds are becoming extinct because they're being overhunted, in many cases by Chinese, going in and paying poachers to kill these animals for their private, now middle class, that are willing to pay these prices for these things. And instead of being flippant about this, why are we not addressing publicly what is behind the economics behind going in and killing these wild animals? Now, wait, let me go forward. And I just want to flip.
Wait.
Okay.
I think I would stop you, and then we have to get somebody else to ask a question. But Rockefeller, for example, he's probably responsible for saving the whales.
Absolutely.
And you know why?
Yes.
Because he was able to market kerosene so very well, And before most of our history, prior to the 1900s, people used whale oil for lighting.
That's
and
right.
so what the free market does, it protects various species of animals. If you go to South Africa, for example, and you go to private game preserves like Londolosi and some others, you don't see the poaching that you see let's say at Kruger National Park. You don't see the poaching because Kruger National Park is a government one. Now, what happens in Londolosi, they advertise in Europe for people to spend $10,000 to come there and do big game hunting. And the people who give $10,000 to them, they want to see big game when they come. And so a poacher at Londolosi, a prospective poacher, he wouldn't come to Londolosi because he knows that he would become a poachee.
Exactly. Exactly.
Because they have a vested interest in protecting the animals. And so I think that what we have to recognize is the role of private property. That is, private property gets people to do those things that are not only in the social interest, but their own interests. And so,
Okay.
but there's such contempt for private property in our country that we have all these effects.
Okay, I only brought this up as a preface for what my real question is, and that is, could you please address artificial intelligence and the conversation going on today between Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and what the real threat to human life is?
You have to ask
with
somebody
us.
else. I don't know.
Really?
Thank you.
First off, Doctor, thank you for coming in a long distance to speak to us. You mentioned greed and your motivation to improve your home so you can sell it later on and make more money. I kind of feel it's much more current than that. I feel you're improving your home so you and your wife can live a better life right now, and to hell with the further generation. What I'm trying to figure out is how do we motivate people to have the same motivations you have to improve your current situation now, and the hell with the further generations.
Well, that's another effect of private property. If you ask the question, would I have the same incentives to forego current consumption to produce something that's going to outlast me if there were a 75% tax when I sold my house? Or if the government owned the house, would I have the same incentives to take care for it? And so whatever weakens a person's private property weakens his incentive to do the socially responsible thing, and the socially responsible thing is to conserve on the scarce resources of our society. And if you look around and you ask the question, what are those things that receive the best care, and what are those things that receive the least care? It happens to be the best care are privately owned things, and the least care are publicly owned things. As I used to tell my students, back at one time, years and years ago, I used to smoke in class. And I used to put the cigarette out on the ground. And so I know some of my students were saying, well, does he do that at home? No, I don't do that at home. Because it's my house. I would bear the cost of my behavior. But if the government owns it, I don't bear the cost. Or another example, my wife used to criticize me about this, is that and she thought it was a bit childish of me, but I like to, when I'm in a car, I like to, at the red light, I like to gun the engine, have the wheels turning and stuff like this, and then when the light turns green, just take off. Well, I only do that in a rental car. I don't do that in my car, because in my car, I have to take into account the current use of the car on its future value. But with a rental car, I don't have to take that into account. And so I hope no Hertz people are here. So the point is, if you want things cared for, you want them privately owned. I mean, you ask who takes care of a house better, an owner of the house or a renter? Well, it's the owner, because it's his property. He has a stake in the future value. Let's ask a couple more questions, then I have to get another drink of wine.
We have one right over here.
Yes, right over here.
And then one over there. You had the last question.
Thank you for your presence and your enlightening speech. Just a simple question for you. As time has passed in the last maybe 30 or 40 years, and we have seen a further and further encroachment on the taking of our treasures by the government, what has happened to the beneficial contributions made by people and the contributory elements of our society during that time? Has there been a substantial decline in that because of the increasing loss of treasure, or is it too difficult to say because of the tax-deductible nature of these contributions? What has been the trade-off between the two?
Well, I could not give you an answer for that, but I think that what is happening is that there are many organizations that are resisting this decline that you mentioned. Young America's Foundation is just one of them, Bradley, and many, many others. You know, back in 1970 or 1960, there was probably no more than 3 or 4 free market organizations in our country. Now there are a whole lot of them. That is, I think that there's an effort to resist the socialization of our country. But it's a hard job. And as my colleague and tenacious mentor, Milton Friedman, used to say, he says, we did not get to where we are overnight, and we're not going to get out overnight. So we have to work hard and pay attention to what we're doing. And that fellow has a question. And then there's this favorite lady of mine, Wendy Borchert. Let her ask a question too.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, and thank you, Bradley Foundation, Young America's Foundation, for the opportunity to ask you a question. You didn't touch on the Federal Reserve and the problems that the Federal Reserve has caused our economy and the hole that we've dug through the Federal Reserve with interest rates being so low for an inordinate amount of time, and the national debt, which is going to keep interest rates low, in my opinion, for a long period of time, and what that has done to savings, and how is that going to affect our economy going forward, and is this the new normal?
Well, I think if I had my way, I would repeal the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And the Federal Reserve, if you look at the justification of the Federal Reserve Act, if you just read the act itself, the purpose of the Federal Reserve was to prevent bank failures and increase price stability. And if you do a simple before and after study, there was greater price stability before the Federal Reserve Act and fewer bank failures before than afterwards. And today, a dollar in 1913 is worth 4 cents today. So it doesn't show a very good job. But of the Federal Reserve. But and so I would repeal the Federal Reserve Act. But just as importantly, we have to ask ourselves, why would we allow 12 people who are on the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, 12 people who are unelected, to have life and death power over the economy of the United States? They're unelected, and there are 12 people who have that power. And so if I had my way, I would repeal the Federal Reserve Act. And that's one of the things that just one of the things that Jackson did, President Jackson, in 1842, did not renew the contract for the Second National Bank. Now, Wendy Borchert, a longtime friend of mine and a troublemaker, she has the last question.
I'm going to be nice to you, and God bless you for all you're doing, and I wish we could clone you. I want to ask you, since polls have shown that 53% of the people in America today receive some form of government assistance, whether it's city, county, state, or federal, what is their reason for voting against their pocketbook when they are receiving benefits from the government? How can we change it?
Well,
And God bless you.
It's very difficult. I mean, it turns out that not only are so many Americans at the federal and state trough, but I believe it's 48 or 49% of Americans have no federal income tax liability. And not having a federal income tax liability makes people natural constituents for big spending politicians. Because if you have no federal income tax liability, what do you care about federal taxes? And matter of fact, this is one of the reasons why the so-called Bush tax cuts weren't very popular. Weren't that popular? Because people who are not paying any federal income tax, why should you be happy about a tax cut? And a tax cut might mean to you that some of your handout programs will be threatened by a tax cut. So I think that every American should have skin in the game. I mean, it's like I don't have any power, any right to tell Ford Motor Company what to do because I don't own any of its stock. I don't have any skin in the game. And I think that that for the American people, we should require each person to have skin in the game. Matter of fact, I wrote a column some years ago. It turned out to be a bit controversial. But I was suggesting that people get one vote per $10,000 in taxes that they paid. And those who thought that would be unfair, just lower the taxes. Right? Thank you very much, folks. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams, not only for coming across the country to deliver this tonight, but for your tireless work in educating students at George Mason and at campuses all across the country.
Well, I've been Walter's colleague for 32 years almost, but I first encountered him when I was an undergraduate economics major. I was watching TV. I think it was Phil Donahue show. I never heard of him, but I could tell we were of like mind, and I was just really impressed with his demeanor, with his smarts, with his quickness, with his intelligence.
I first met Walter Williams in the summer of 1969 when I was teaching summer school at UCLA. And just one day, some tall guy walks into the room and says, "I've heard that you have ideas like mine."
When I was asked to interview here at George Mason, one of the first things that occurred to me is that, wow, if I get this job, I'll be a colleague of Walter Williams.
He never took a class from me. He came to me precisely because he had already independently arrived at the very same kinds of conclusions that I arrived at.
Walter grew up playing basketball with Will Chamberlain, just on the streets. And Walter wanted to go into the NBA, but he figured, what are the chances of him succeeding in the NBA given that he's only the second best basketball player in his small Philadelphia neighborhood? Well, the best one was Will Chamberlain.
Walter is not a go along to get along kind of guy. And that's a very large part of his being willing to say things that I'm sure that many other people knew, but were not about to say.
Walter's a radical. The positions he takes in economics are very radical. He's against the minimum wage, he's against all rent control, he's against income redistribution. And Walter takes these positions because he understands, I think correctly, that if the government followed his advice, the lives of people in America would be more prosperous and more free and better, and especially the lives of poor people.
Walter understands that government regulations typically operate to the disadvantage of low-income people in general and low-income minorities in particular.
The first book that I read that Walter had written was called The State Against Blacks. I remember that book impressed me for two reasons. Number one, the clarity of exposition. Walter writes because he wants to be read and understood, and so he's mastered clarity of exposition. The second thing that impressed me about that book was the very effective use of empirical data. He wasn't just throwing numbers out to show that he could throw numbers out.
Walter has to back up his work and his conclusions precisely because they are so unusual People on the other side don't. They can say anything they want, and if it's what's current in that area, it passes.
It's not typical to hear a black man say what Walter says. His eloquence, the quality of his arguments, the sincerity of his arguments, his knowledge, those are what make Walter Williams great. Those are the things that make Walter Williams effective.
He was the only man I know who had no trouble finding a parking space in downtown Washington because he came in somewhere between 4 and 5 a.m.
Walter will be 81 very soon, and he hasn't slowed down. The guy is amazing.
One of the things that Walter has tried to do is explain the value of freedom, not only in and of itself, but also as a means of greater prosperity.
He is a great champion of individual liberty. Above all, that's what Walter is. It has nothing to do with color, it has nothing to do with sex, it has nothing to do with nationality. Walter believes in and cherishes individual liberty for everyone, and he wants to see everyone be as free as possible.